Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. English Podcast. I'm Emma. James gave a presentation recently. Good data, clear structure, strong opinions. And afterwards, a senior colleague pulled him aside and said something that is, I think, one of the most useful and underrated pieces of feedback you can receive.
Hey everyone, I'm James. She said, mimicking feedback, deadpan. Your points were good, James, but I kept losing the thread between them.
Not that the arguments were wrong, not that the vocabulary was weak. The connections between the arguments were invisible. And the reason they were invisible is that 6 specific words and phrases were missing from the whole presentation.
6 words. And today, Emma is going to show me, and all of you, exactly what those 6 words are, what they each actually do, and why getting them even slightly wrong sounds worse than not using them at all.
Discourse markers. Let's get into it.
Welcome. So glad you're here. This is Mr. English Podcast. Today is for writers, for presenters, for anyone who wants their arguments to read or sound like a coherent whole, rather than a list of good points that happen to be near each other.
Discourse markers are the signposts that tell the reader, or the listener, which direction the argument is turning before it turns. Let's start with the most commonly confused pair. James's presentation was on remote work versus office work. One of his slides said this, and I'm going to read it as he originally wrote it. Remote work offers employees greater flexibility. Office work builds team culture and face-to-face collaboration. Both models have clear advantages.
Which is true.
Which is true, and which sounds like a list. The reader has to do the work of noticing these are being compared. The argument isn't built. The material is just placed next to each other. Now, listen to the same content with one marker added.
Remote work offers employees greater flexibility. In contrast, office work builds team culture and face-to-face collaboration.
In contrast does something very specific. It connects 2 separate sentences and signals directly. What is coming is different from what just came. It lives between 2 complete sentences. Full stop, then in contrast, comma, then the second sentence.
So it's a connector between sentences, not inside a sentence.
Exactly. And whereas does the same contrast job, but differently. It's a conjunction, working inside a single sentence, linking 2 clauses. Remote work offers flexibility, whereas office work builds team culture. One sentence, both ideas inside it. The contrast is built into the structure rather than signaled between structures.
So in contrast needs 2 sentences, whereas needs 1.
That's the practical distinction. And they're not interchangeable. You cannot write, remote work offers flexibility, whereas office work builds team culture. That whereas is now dangling at the start of a sentence with no first clause to contrast against. It's incomplete. Whereas always needs both sides in the same sentence.
If James had used either of these on that slide, the colleague wouldn't have had to do the mental work of figuring out the relationship between the 2 points.
The marker does that work for them. That is exactly what a discourse marker is for. Spoken version, in a presentation, in contrast does the same thing, but it's slightly softer because your voice can do some of the work too. Remote work offers flexibility. In contrast, office work builds a very different kind of value. The pause after in contrast gives the audience a half second to pivot with you.
So even in speaking, the marker plus a beat works better than just putting 2 points in sequence.
Always. The signpost before the turn, not after.
Okay. On the contrary. I've been using this for years as a synonym for in contrast or however. I suspect this is about to go badly for me.
It is. On the contrary is one of the most misused discourse markers in advanced learner English. And using it incorrectly actually sounds worse than not using it at all, because native speakers hear the mismatch immediately.
What does it actually mean?
It specifically exclusively contradicts a claim that was just stated, or a claim the reader might naturally assume. It says what you just heard or what you might think is not just different, it's the opposite. It's not simply a contrast between two things. It's a direct rebuttal of a stated or implied position.
Give me an example of correct use.
The transition to remote work was not smooth for most companies. On the contrary, it created significant operational disruption. The first sentence makes a claim that the transition was not smooth. On the contrary, comes in and says, and I don't mean slightly difficult, I mean the opposite of smooth. It was actively disruptive. It's an intensifier of negation, not a pivot to a different topic.
And incorrect use?
Some employees prefer remote work. On the contrary, others prefer the office. That is not a contradiction. Neither of those statements negates the other. Some people prefer remote work. That is simply true. Others prefer the office. Also simply true. No claim is being contradicted. In contrast is the right marker there.
So if I can replace on the contrary with in contrast, and the sentence still makes sense, I probably shouldn't be using on the contrary.
That is a very clean test. If the two things are simply different, in contrast. If one thing directly negates or is the opposite of a stated claim, on the contrary. The word that gives it away is not. On the contrary almost always follows a sentence that contains not or a negative meaning. The process is not quick. On the contrary, it requires months.
I've been using this wrong for years.
Most people at B2 level have. And using it correctly from this point forward will sound immediately more sophisticated than most of what's written around it. Friends, first comment challenge. Write one sentence using on the contrary correctly. A real contradiction, not just a contrast. Drop it in the comments. We genuinely want to check them.
Group 3. After all and nevertheless. These feel slightly different in tone from the contrast markers.
They are. They're concession markers. They acknowledge something is true and then either justify it or proceed despite it. And the difference between the two is directional.
Say more.
After all looks backward. It introduces a reason or justification for something already said. We should be patient with learners who make mistakes. After all, everyone begins somewhere. The after all is reminding the reader of a truth they might have overlooked, which makes the original statement feel more grounded.
It's like saying, and here's the thing that makes that obvious, in case you hadn't considered it.
Exactly. It has a slightly warm, even persuasive quality, as if you're saying, you already know this, really, if you think about it. In James's presentation, a sentence like, we should be open to hybrid models. After all, the evidence for flexibility improving productivity is substantial. Would have made the recommendation feel grounded in logic the audience already accepts.
And nevertheless.
Nevertheless looks forward. It concedes a point, yes, this is true, and then says, and yet we proceed. The research on this topic is still inconclusive. Nevertheless, the findings are significant enough to warrant action. I'm not denying the inconclusiveness. I'm choosing to act despite it. That's a much more intellectually honest move than pretending the obstacle doesn't exist.
It signals that you've considered the objection and decided to move forward anyway.
Which sounds more credible in a formal argument than simply ignoring the counter-evidence. In a spoken presentation, nevertheless also carries a useful weight of its own. It sounds deliberate, which is exactly how you want to sound when pivoting from a concession back to your main argument.
After all, warms the previous point. Nevertheless, hardens the next one.
That's a very precise summary, and I'm stealing it. And the sixth marker. the most sophisticated and the rarest. By the same token.
I've heard this. I've always been slightly afraid of it.
Most people are, because it does something none of the other 5 markers do. It doesn't contrast. It doesn't contradict. It doesn't concede. It says the same logic that applies to the first thing also applies to the second. It extends an argument's reasoning to a parallel case.
Give me the example from the presentation context.
James was arguing that companies have a responsibility to invest in their employees' development. He could have written, if we expect employees to perform at a high level, by the same token, we must provide them with the tools and training to make that possible. The logic of, if you want X, you must provide Y, is applied directly to the employer-employee relationship. The same reasoning, a parallel case.
It signals that you're being logically consistent, not just generating observations.
And that's why it sounds immediately more sophisticated than almost anything else in this list. It says to the reader, I am applying my reasoning consistently. I am not making an exception for this case. The same rule applies here as applies there.
When can you use it in speech?
In formal presentations and debates, very effectively. We cannot expect transparency from institutions that we ourselves are not willing to be transparent about. By the same token, we cannot demand accountability from others if we refuse it ourselves. The pause after by the same token gives the audience a moment to anticipate the logical extension before you state it.
Actually, building on that, I want to say that some people prefer tea to coffee. On the contrary, others find coffee gives them too much energy.
James,
What?
that is not a contradiction. Some people prefer tea, true. Others find coffee too stimulating, also true, and not in any way the opposite of what came before. Those two facts coexist perfectly comfortably. Nothing is being negated. In contrast is the marker you need there, or even just meanwhile. Right. Some people prefer tea. In contrast, others find coffee too stimulating. Or even no marker at all, since the contrast isn't particularly important to the argument. Exactly. And 3 common mistakes beyond that. 1, using nevertheless when you mean however. Nevertheless carries the sense of, despite everything just said, we proceed. However is lighter, more neutral. Using nevertheless in a sentence where the stakes aren't that high makes the writing feel overdramatic. 2, using whereas at the start of a sentence on its own. Whereas office work builds culture. That's incomplete. Whereas needs both clauses in the same sentence. And 3, using after all to mean finally or in conclusion. After all, it was a long week. That's casual speech, not a discourse marker. In formal writing, after all introduces a justifying truth. It does not summarize. Friends, second comment challenge. Write one sentence using after all correctly in a formal argument context. We want to see how you use it. Practice. Here is a disconnected paragraph, the kind James might have written before today. Read it, then rewrite it, using at least 3 markers from today's 6. Reading flatly, rhythmically disconnected. Original. Many organizations are moving toward a 4-day working week. There are productivity concerns about this shift. Studies from Iceland suggest output remained the same or improved. Employees reported significantly lower stress levels. Not every sector can implement this model equally. The argument for wider adoption is compelling. That reads as 6 statements sitting next to each other. No architecture. No signposting. The reader has to build the logic themselves.
Rewritten version. Using nevertheless, after all, in contrast, whereas. Many organizations are moving toward a 4-day working week, whereas others remain committed to the traditional model. There are productivity concerns about this shift. Nevertheless, studies from Iceland suggest output remained the same or improved. After all, Reduced stress and greater focus often produce better results than longer hours in isolation. Not every sector can implement this model equally. In contrast, knowledge-based industries appear particularly well-suited to the change. The argument for wider adoption is, despite the caveats, compelling.
Same facts. 4 markers. The argument now moves like an argument, not like a list.
Write your own rewrite in the comments. Use at least 3 markers from today. We will read every one.
6 discourse markers. 4 functional groups. In contrast and whereas for pure contrast. In contrast between sentences, whereas inside one sentence. On the contrary for direct contradiction only, not a synonym for however or in contrast. After all, to look backward and justify forward. Nevertheless, to look forward and proceed despite. And by the same token, to extend the same logic to a parallel case. The rarest, the most sophisticated, and the one that signals most clearly that an argument is being constructed, not just assembled.
James's colleague said, "Your points were good, but I kept losing the thread." The markers are the thread. They don't add new information. They tell the reader how to hold the information together. That's the whole job.
Here's the only ask. Not all 6. 2. Pick the 2 markers from today that feel most relevant to something you're writing or presenting this week. Use them. Just those 2. Once they're in the writing, the other 4 will start looking obvious.
If today's episode helped you, please give it a like. It means a lot, especially for a more advanced episode like this one. Share it with someone writing an essay, a report, or preparing a formal presentation. Subscribe to Mr. English Podcast for a new episode every week. And leave your rewritten paragraph or your on the contrary sentence in the comments. We read every single one.
The thread was always there. Now you can show it.
See you next time on Mr. English Podcast.